All right, so today I want to start off with the smallest level of biological complexity. And I want to talk about atoms. I want to talk about elements. And specifically, I want to talk about the elements that we find in the human body. So here we have the periodic table. These are all the different elements that are found, as far as we know, in the universe. And there's a handful of these, there's more than a handful, I'd say, that are found in the human body. But of all of those elements that are found in the human body, 4 of them make up the vast majority of the human body. So what I'd like you all to do is get back into your little groups again, and I would, out of all of these elements here, I want you to pick out the 4 elements that you think compose the majority of the human body. And that's by weight. Not by number, not the number of atoms of each element, but according to weight, which atoms or which elements compose the majority of the human body. So pick out 4, and then when you're done with that, order them from what you think is the most weight to the least weight. All right, give that a shot for a second. All right, what did some people come up with? Raise your hand if you would like to suggest an element that you think is one of the top 4 elements of the body with regards to weight.
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen, okay. Anybody agree with that? A couple head nods.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, okay. So we have oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen. Those all sound pretty good. But which one of those do you think composes the most weight of the body?
Hydrogen.
Oxygen.
We have hydrogen and oxygen. What might be the problem with saying that hydrogen composes the most weight of the body?
It's really so light.
It's the smallest of the elements. Okay, it's the smallest of all of them. So number 1 on the list, the element that composes the majority of the human body is oxygen. 65% of the weight of the human body is from oxygen molecules. Oxygen atoms and molecules. That's surprising to me. Okay. What about number 2? Carbon is number 2. Not so surprising. Number 3, we have hydrogen coming in at almost 10% of our body weight is determined by hydrogen. And the last, we have nitrogen. About 3% of our body weight comes from nitrogen. What are some elements that we're missing here that you know we find in the human body?
Calcium.
Calcium. Iron, sodium, potassium, chloride, zinc, copper, all sorts of stuff. So here's a list of all these other elements that take up a lesser percentage. Surprisingly, 1.5% of the body weight comes from calcium. Why is that surprising?
Bones.
Because your bones are made up of calcium and phosphorus, and you'd think that those comprise quite a bit of weight. But calcium is only coming in at 1.5%. We have phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. And then we have some other elements that we call trace elements that are just found in little dust amounts, like zinc and copper. And they're very important, but they're just not a very significant amount of weight when it comes to the body. Has anybody watched Breaking Bad, the series Breaking Bad? There is an episode, season 1, episode 3, and I put the link to this video on the suggested YouTube videos. But what's the main character's name? Is it Arthur or? Walter, yeah. Walter and Jesse, they're cleaning up a body that I will just say has been decomposing. And as they're going through that scene, it's going back to a scene of Walter when he was in chemistry and he's talking with this girl And they're going through this exact same thing. They're talking about all the different elements that make up the body. And he has, a lot of the same surprise reactions that you might have had. Be that in mind, when they're talking about elements, they're talking about elements with regards to the number of elements in the body. Like, what's the most abundant element in the body, not necessarily by weight, just to keep in mind. So 65% of the body weight comes from oxygen. Where do we find oxygen in the body? It's a part of water, H2O. And the body is 60% made up of water, so there's a significant amount of oxygen there. Where else are we going to find a lot, maybe even more, oxygen? In the blood. And where specifically do we find oxygen in the blood?
Red blood cells?
It's within the red blood cells. Good. So where do we find oxygen? Where do we find hydrogen? Well, here's the human body composition. 60 to 70% of the body is made up of water, H2O. So that's a significant amount of hydrogen and oxygen right there. And you might say, well, for every, in every water molecule, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, so why isn't hydrogen a higher percentage of our body weight? And why is that the case? What's the molecular weight of oxygen? It's 16. What's the molecular weight of hydrogen? It's only 1. So we find a lot of hydrogen and a lot of water in water. All the fluids in the body are water-based. They're all made up of 90% of water or more. What are some fluids we find? What are some fluids we find in the body? What do we call the fluid within the cells? We call that intracellular fluid. What do we call the fluid in between the cells? And I have a list of these that's going to pop up here, so you don't have to write them down right away. What do we call the fluid we find in the microscopic spaces in between the cells? We call that interstitial fluid. What's the fluid part of blood? That's your plasma. Going through the digestive tract, there's saliva, there's gastric juice, there's pancreatic juice, there's bile. In the joints of the body, all of these synovial joints have a cap around them and they're filled by synovial fluid. So there's water all throughout the body. Oh, maybe I didn't let that one go. Intracellular fluid, interstitial fluid, plasma. Okay. Where else do we find oxygen besides the water? Well, you guys said in the red blood cells, and that's correct. This is an image up in the lungs. This is an individual air sac, which we call an alveolus. Has anybody heard that term before? Alveoli, or singular is alveolus. Well, that's a microscopic air sac in the lungs, and the lungs are made up of millions and millions of these individual alveoli. When you breathe in, the air goes through the respiratory tract, through the respiratory tree, and it ends up in these alveoli, which are dead ends. Okay, so the air comes down here and it circulates. And what happens here? Well, oxygen is going to move from the lungs, from the alveoli, into the blood. And at the same time, carbon dioxide is dropped off. What happens to that oxygen? Well, it goes in the blood and it goes within the red blood cell. And within the red blood cells are really interesting. Red blood cells don't have any organelles. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have mitochondria, anything like that. What they do have are about 250 million hemoglobin molecules. And that's what these are representing here. And oxygen is specifically binding to these hemoglobin molecules.
What is hemoglobin made of?
We're actually going to get into that. I use hemoglobin as kind of a common theme throughout this class and in Bio 242. I talk about hemoglobin quite a bit, so we'll get into that. So the answer to our question then, I guess, is where do we find oxygen? Well, we find a lot of it within red blood cells. Specifically, it's bound to hemoglobin within red blood cells. Something else I want to point out about oxygen is when oxygen exists on its own, what do you notice about it? Does it travel by itself? It's bound to another oxygen. So it's a, I think the term for it is a diatomic molecule or something to that effect, where when it's on its own, it exists in a pair with itself. So O2.
When it bonds to hemoglobin, is it still O2?
It is. Yep. And so what happens to oxygen? What are these red blood cells going to do to oxygen? Well, the vasculature has access to every cell in the body. So the red blood cells are going to go to the cells of the body. They're going to release this oxygen. This is a cell right here. You can imagine a plasma membrane around it. That oxygen is going to diffuse from the red blood cell through the blood into the cell. And what's the cell going to do with it? The cell uses oxygen. It requires oxygen for a really important cellular process that we're going to get into the details of later in the quarter, cellular respiration, where we take glucose and we're essentially taking glucose and we're converting that to adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is the chemical form of energy that all living things use. This is just a side note, but when oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, it turns bright red. So oxygenated blood in the body, for instance in the aorta and all the major branches of the aorta, is oxygenated and it's bright red. Once that oxygen gets dropped off to the cells of the body and it's low in oxygen, it becomes kind of this darker maroon color red. Deoxygenated blood is not blue. It looks that way because of the way light filters through the skin, but it's actually this kind of maroon color here. Yeah.
How did they get it to do that, even though that picture looks like it's out in the open with oxygen?
I mean, I guess you can draw blood from two areas of the body and just drop it on there.
It won't bond it with the oxygen in the air.
Nope, it's good there for a little while. All right, so that's where we find oxygen. We find it bound to water, we find it in red blood cells, and it's also within the cells of the body as well. Where do we find hydrogen? We find hydrogen as part of water. Hydrogen also exists as a free ion in the solutions of the body. So if you were to take the chemical composition of the fluids of the body, you would see free hydrogen ions in there. And why is that important? Well, the levels of hydrogen ion in a solution determine its pH. pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. This is the pH scale. It runs from 0 to 14, with about 7 being neutral. Values that are less than 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, those are acidic. Values higher than 7, 8, 9, 10 through 14, those are basic. Do acidic solutions, if this is a neutral solution, do acidic solutions have a lot of hydrogen or a little free hydrogen? A lot. So the more free hydrogen you have, the more acidic you become, and the lower the pH value. So that's another place we find hydrogen. It's just as a free ion in the fluids of the body. This is just a little addition to that. These are the optimal pH of the body fluids. Arterial blood has an optimal pH of 7.4. Venous blood is slightly more acidic, and then the fluid inside the cells is pretty much neutral at 7. So we covered water. 60 to 70% of the body is made up of water, but about 20% of the body is made up of what we call macromolecules. These are large molecules. What did we say nucleic acids were? What are two examples? What are the two examples of nucleic acids? DNA and RNA. Okay, we'll look at that. Proteins, carbohydrates, lipids are the other examples of macromolecules that we find in the body. So if we want to know what the body's made up of, we want to know what elements make up these macromolecules. And that's exactly what we're going to do. This is a diagram of a protein. And a protein is what we call a polymer. Poly is many, mer is units. So a polymer is something made up of many individual units. So the question is, what are the individual units that link together chemically to make a protein? What are the individual units that link together to form a protein? What are proteins made up of? Amino acids. These are all individual amino acids. And this is a protein in what it's called, it's a linear structure. But what's going to happen is these proteins are going to bend back on themselves and they form these complex three-dimensional structures. Anyways, there's 20 amino acids that make up the proteins that we find in the body, and this is just a little subset of them. So these are all different types of amino acids. What type of atoms make up these amino acids? What do you guys see in here with regards to the atoms, the elements that make up amino acids and therefore proteins?
The four most common or most.
Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. There you go. Those are the four most common elements found in the body, at least according to weight. All the same ones there. In fact, all of this group has those four elements in them. Here's a sulfur, so there can be other elements in it as well. What are some examples of proteins that we find in the body? Skeletal muscle is made up of proteins. So therefore, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up skeletal muscles. Antibodies are proteins. So they're made up of those same atoms, those same elements. Enzymes are proteins as well. And this molecule here we have ourselves a hemoglobin molecule. And we should just get familiar with hemoglobin because I'm going to come back to this throughout the quarter. But this is a hemoglobin molecule, and it's made up of what are called these globin chains. There's 2 beta globin chains, and there's 2 alpha globin chains. And all of those globin chains are proteins. Now, bound to each one of these globin chains is what we call a heme group. And here we have that heme group. It's a carbon ring structure with carbon, hydrogen. And dead center in the middle of this heme group, what element, what atom do we find right in the middle of this heme group? What does Fe stand for? That's iron. And when I say that O2 molecules bind to hemoglobin, they're specifically binding to the iron molecule within this heme group. What about carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are also polymers, and the individual units are monosaccharides. Glucose, fructose, galactose. Which one of these monosaccharides is the most important with regards to human physiology? Glucose. It's our primary source of sugar. The brain is highly dependent on glucose. One of the reasons, the main reasons you need your blood sugar to be stable is that the brain is constantly using glucose. So you need that constant supply in the blood. What type of atoms, what type of elements make up carbohydrates? Carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens. And those same molecules. So it's a ring structure, and it's not showing you what atom is found right there, but by default, what atoms are we finding right there on the corners? Carbons. Okay, these are all carbon based. This is a carbon ring. There's an oxygen there, but these are all carbons. And then we have lipids. And with regards to nutritional lipids, the lipids we ingest, and the lipids that are found in subcutaneous fat, for instance, it's in the form of what we call a triglyceride. So your subcutaneous fat layer is a bunch of triglyceride molecules in adipose cells. And what are these lipids, what are these triglycerides made of? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so there's a theme here. And then lastly, with regards to the macromolecules, we have DNA and RNA. And here is the double-stranded DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is also a polymer. It's a molecule made up of many individual units. And the individual units are what we call nucleotides. And this is one of those nucleotides here. And if you want to find them, so this is the double-stranded DNA. If you were to unravel that, this is what it would look like. This is one strand of the DNA. This is another strand over there. And this, and this makes up an individual nucleotide. This, and this makes up another nucleotide. Here's another one. There's another one. So those are the individual units that are making up DNA. And looking at this structure here, we're going to find the same. There's our carbons, there's our oxygen, there's our hydrogen. But what else do we have on here that's making up DNA?
Phosphorus.
We have phosphate molecules. Good, we have a phosphorus.
Nitrogen.
We also find nitrogen in there. Another important molecule in the body, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Why did I say that ATP was so important? We'll have plenty of time to talk about this throughout the quarter. But ATP is the chemical form that cells use for energy. A cell can't take a glucose molecule and do work by it. It's got to take that glucose, convert it to ATP, and then the cell uses ATP to do work. And here's the structure of ATP. It looks a lot like an individual nucleotide, actually. So we have our carbons, hydrogens, oxygens. What else do we find? Nitrogens
Phosphorus.
and phosphorus molecules. what other elements have important functions in the body? What about all these guys right here? When it comes to the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, spinal nerves, cranial nerves, the mass, the big communication control system of the body, the nervous system requires appropriate levels of sodium, chloride, potassium, and calcium to do its job. I'm trying to think where iodine is required. It says it is, so I assume it is somewhere. I just can't think of where iodine is required by the nervous system.
It's to make hormones that regulate metabolism.
Oh, well, that kind of proves my point. It's required by the endocrine system to make thyroid hormone, which regulates metabolism, but I don't think it's directly required by the nervous system. So sodium, chloride, especially sodium, potassium, and calcium, are required for proper functioning of the nervous system. Bones and teeth are mainly calcium and phosphate. So that kind of goes through all of these guys here. And then we have what we call these trace elements, and these represent the trace elements. Less than 0.1% of body weight, but very important. Why do we need iron? To bind oxygen, to bind hemoglobin, found on hemoglobin. If you have an iron deficiency in your diet, it can result in what we call anemia. Anemia just means low blood oxygen, and there's lots of different things that can cause it. One of those is low dietary iron. Because if you don't have a lot of iron, then you don't have properly made hemoglobin, which means you're not properly binding enough oxygen. If you go to the co-op or anywhere, the supplement portion, you'll probably see all of these trace elements. You know, some with varying levels of, effective claims, I should say. But what about zinc? When you go to the zinc section, what kind of stuff is it promoting?
Immune system.
Immune system. Good. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to take a little deeper dive into why sodium and calcium are required for the nervous system. And I think this is important because, I might as well introduce the nervous system right now and the functioning of the nervous system. And sodium and calcium are specifically, critical for that. So with regards to sodium and potassium, one place that we can find those, both of those are in the blood. Sodium and potassium circulate freely in the blood. And sodium levels in the blood directly affect blood pressure. If you have high levels of first of all, sodium and potassium, those are both things that we want to maintain homeostasis over. We want a certain level of those atoms in the blood. And for sodium, that range is 135 to 145 milliequivalent per liter or something like that. I'm not quite sure of the units here. But if you have low levels of sodium, what would be the clinical term for that? Low levels of sodium. What's the clinical term for sodium? Natremia. And what would low levels of sodium be? Hyponatremia. Hypo means below. If your levels of sodium are too high, then you have a state of hypernatremia. And like I said, the levels of sodium in the blood directly affects blood pressure. And your kidneys are responsible for regulating the amount of sodium in the blood. If you have high levels of sodium in the blood, is your blood pressure going to be probably too high or too low? If you have high levels of sodium in the blood, if you have hypernatremia, would you expect that patient's blood pressure to be high or low? It's going to be high. And the real easy way to think about that is wherever sodium goes, water follows it. So if you have sodium moving from the kidneys, from the urine into the blood, water is going to follow that. And what happens to blood pressure when you increase the amount of water in there? It goes up. This is the diagram of a cell, I guess. Here's the plasma membrane. This is the fluid outside of the cell, and this is the fluid inside of the cell. The concentration of sodium is much higher outside the cell than inside the cell. The concentration of potassium is much higher inside the cell than outside the cell. And that's on purpose. That is the job of what we call this sodium-potassium pump, which is found in the plasma membrane. It takes 3 sodiums, pumps it outside of the cell, 2 potassiums, and pumps it inside of the cell. So the bottom line is that you have a high level of sodium outside the cell and a small level inside the cell. Now, the fact that we're moving 3 positive charges outside of the cell and only 2 inside the cell means that we're going to have a net negative charge inside the cell. If you were to take a voltmeter, something that measures electricity, and you were to measure the voltage inside the cell, it would be negative. If you were to put it inside of a neuron, it would be about minus 70 millivolts. And the reason it has a negative charge is because it's pumping all of that positive sodium outside of the cell, which makes the inside negative. Now, why is that important? Why am I bringing that up? Well, that gradient, that sodium gradient, is critical to nervous system function. So here we have a neuron. This is an individual nerve cell. And this is the fluid outside the cell, this is inside, and I want you to imagine that there's a much higher concentration of sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. And because of that, there's a negative charge inside this neuron. Now, sodium on its own cannot pass freely through the plasma membrane into and out of the cell. There has to be what we call a channel that allows it to go through. And given the opportunity, this is called a voltage-gated sodium channel. If this channel opens, what's going to happen to sodium? Is sodium going to rush from an area of high to low concentration? Or is it going to move from an area of low concentration inside the cell and move out? So the question is, given the opportunity, meaning these sodium channels open, which way is sodium going to move? Is it going to move into the cell or out of the cell? It's going to move into the cell. And why is it going to do that? There's 2 reasons for it. One is because there's a higher concentration outside than inside. So by a property called diffusion, it diffuses into the cell. Can anybody think of another reason why sodium may rush into the cell? There's a negative charge inside the neuron. So the positively charged sodium rushes in towards the negative charge. Opposites attract. When that sodium rushes into the cell, what does it do? It follows this negative charge down the neuron. And the flow of sodium ions in the body, where you have sodium flowing through something, that represents electricity of the body. That is electricity in the body. The flow of sodium ions or any other ion represents electricity. And how does the nervous system communicate? It communicates by electricity. Yes?
What is the negative charge in the nerve cell?
It's about minus 70 millivolts.
So like why is it there? Like,
It's there because there's a lot of positively charged sodium outside the cell. There's also negatively charged particles inside the cell. It's just an overall balance of the ion concentration. There's more positive ions outside than there is inside.
so the negative charges, those are just other negative ions?
They're negative ions, but it's also relative. Like if it's more positive outside, yeah, another way to look at that is just it's negative relative to the outside. So that's one of the main principles that I'm trying to get here, is not just that there's more sodium outside than inside, and that sodium rushes in given the opportunity, but sodium flowing down this neuron represents electricity. And electricity is how neurons communicate. How they communicate with other neurons, how they control skeletal muscles, how they control smooth muscle, all that type of stuff. What we're looking at here is the end of a neuron. That's what we call the axon terminal. So what's happening is this neuron has been activated, there's sodium, there's electricity flowing down the neuron, and now that sodium reaches the ends of the neuron. These are called the axon terminals. And what can this neuron make contact with? What can it synapse with? Well, it can make contact with another neuron. It can make contact with muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle. It can also make contact with glandular tissues, the glands of the body. But in the instance that we're going to look at, we're going to have this neuron communicating with another neuron, sending information from one neuron to the next. How does that happen? We have a message from one neuron that we want to send to another neuron. How do we do that? Well, first of all, the message from this neuron to this neuron is going to be transmitted by these little chemical messengers there. Does anybody know the name of those little chemical messengers that are going to be released from one neuron onto the next?
Neurotransmitters.
Those are neurotransmitters. So how are those neurotransmitters going to be released? Well, here's our nerve impulse coming down. And by a nerve impulse, what do we mean? I mean sodium ions are flowing down the neuron. Sodium ions flow down the neuron, and they open what are called these voltage-gated calcium channels. This is a lot of complex stuff, but we're going to revisit it in A&P, and it's just it's a good thing to know how these neurons work. So sodium ions, this positively charged sodium flows down the axon to the axon terminal. That changes the voltage, and it opens these voltage-gated calcium channels. What happens next? Sodium moves from outside the cell inside the cell. What happens next? Sodium coming into the cell causes these little spheres here. We call those synaptic vesicles. And what are these little bubbles inside the synaptic vesicles? Those are neurotransmitters being stored there. So the flood of calcium inside the neuron causes these synaptic vesicles to move to the plasma membrane, and it causes them to release these neurotransmitters onto the neuron below it. The neurotransmitters bind to these receptors, they open a channel, and maybe sodium floods into this other neuron, and the message continues. All of this is being recorded, so when you go to answer your questions on the sodium and calcium involvement in the nervous system, you can go back and watch that. Yes?
Maybe we're going to talk about this later, but what is like the reuptake unit? When they talk about. yeah,
Sure.
or reuptake.
So, you know, you want these, when you want to communicate a message from one neuron to another, you do that by releasing these neurotransmitters. But after you've communicated that message, you want the message to go away. So these neurotransmitters don't just hang out in this area. It's not shown here, but there's little pumps or little proteins that take those neurotransmitters and move them back up into the neuron up here. Yep. And in fact, there's a class of medications, antidepressants, called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What does serotonin do? It's a neurotransmitter found in the brain, and when it binds to these cells, it makes you feel good. It's like dopamine. Okay, it's a feel-good neurotransmitter. So what these antidepressants do is they bind to these pumps that typically move serotonin back into the cell, and they block them from doing that. So serotonin hangs out much longer in this space, and it stimulates the neuron it's acting on for a prolonged period of time. And then the last few slides just have to do with some other elements. Calcium, besides being important in the bones and teeth and the nervous system, it's also critical for the blood clotting process. Here's an injured vessel, and there's a bunch of clotting factors that have to come in to clot the vessel and try to fix it. And calcium is critical for activating these clotting factors. Does anybody in their work setting use any type of anticoagulants? Let's say you want to take a blood sample and you want to prevent it from coagulating. You want to prevent it from clumping up. Well, there's some types of anticoagulants, EDTA for instance, that binds free calcium. And so if it binds calcium, it prevents it from activating these clotting factors. What about zinc? Zinc is involved in immune function. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is iodine. Iodine is a trace element. Why does the body need iodine? Well, iodine is required to build thyroid hormone. This is the thyroid gland. Does anybody know where you find the thyroid gland on your body? So you can start by palpating the larynx, these two flat cartilage plates, and about just below that, the thyroid gland wraps around the trachea right below the larynx. And the thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone. There's two forms, T4 and T3. And this is our major metabolic hormone. So it acts on all the cells of the body and stimulates metabolism. It stimulates cellular respiration. And iodine is critical, well, it's necessary to build that thyroid hormone.